Alright, so this is exactly what nobody in the room wanted to admit out loud, and now here we are anyway. See, the second you sit down and try to unpack what is really happening between 50 Cent and Rick Ross, you realize this is not a rap beef anymore, and it stopped being a rap beef a long time ago. This is a full-blown character study, and the guy holding the pen on his own biography right now is Rick Ross, because every single time this man opens his mouth in 2026, he is not landing a punch on 50 Cent. He is stepping directly on his own shoelaces in front of the entire culture. And truth is, right here, that is the part one want you to lock in on before we even get to the mess with Courtney Kemp, before we get to the Eminem line that had the whole internet crying laughing, before we get to the Tupac shot that honestly should have never left his lips. Because the deeper you go into this story, the more it looks less like two heavyweights trading blows and more like one man handing the other man an unloaded gun and then pointing at his own foot. And I know some of you are already typing in the comments, saying I am biased, saying I always lean 50 Cent, but I want you to hear me all the way out today, because this one is bigger than a preference. This one is a case study. This one is a warning shot for every rapper in the game about what happens when you pick the wrong opponent at the wrong time with the wrong ammo. So let me set the table for you, because I do not want anybody rolling in here late. 50 Cent recently sat down with GQ for one of those long, cinematic, career retrospective interviews, the kind of sit-down where the lighting is soft and the questions get sharp, and inside that conversation, 50 Cent finally opened up about a piece of the power puzzle that fans have been chewing on for years. Now, if you have followed 50 Cent's television empire the way most of this audience has, you already know power is not just a show, power is a universe. There is power. There is Power Book 2 Ghost. There is Raising Cannon. There is Power Book Force. There is Power Book 4 Influence coming down the pipeline. And the woman whose fingerprints are on the DNA of that entire cinematic architecture is Courtney Kemp. Nobody is disputing that. 50 Cent is not disputing that. Courtney Kemp is the writer, the creator, the showrunner, and the mind behind the map. But 50 Cent is the engine that gave the map somewhere to go, and that distinction, that one right there, is where all the tension in this story was born. That is the fuse. That is the crack in the foundation that Rick Ross tried to widen this week, and that is the crack that ended up swallowing him instead. And once you see that crack for what it really is, you cannot unsee it, and you cannot pretend Rick Ross was ever making a real argument here. Because what 50 Cent said in that GQ interview was not a diss, it was not a shot, and it was not a swing at Courtney Kemp's talent. What 50 Cent said, and I am going to paraphrase him carefully because the wording matters, is that when a creator experiences that kind of monster-level success for the first time in their career, sometimes ego takes over. Sometimes ownership becomes a knife fight, and sometimes the person who wrote the words in the room starts to resent the person whose name is on the poster outside. Publicly, power reads as a 50 Cent property. It sounds like 50 Cent. The music underneath every episode is 50 Cent. The Southside Jamaica Queens texture is 50 Cent Ghost. Tommy, Cannon, Tariq, every single one of those characters walks and talks in a world 50 Cent invented before he ever picked up a script. And according to 50 Cent, that reality started to weigh heavy on the room, because the woman writing that world felt like her authorship was getting swallowed by a shadow. And when a writer feels swallowed, she reaches for a pen to prove ownership. And in television, that pen is usually the delete key. That is how careers die in a writer's room. That is how characters die in a writer's room. And that is exactly what almost happened to Ghost. That is exactly the shadow that almost fell across Omari Hardwick's entire storyline before 50 Cent stepped in and blocked the door. 50 Cent said, plainly, that behind the scenes there was friction between Courtney Kemp and Omari Hardwick, because Omari Hardwick was the face of the show, the man carrying every scene, the actor whose stare could hold a whole hour of prestige drama on his shoulders. And apparently, Courtney Kemp wanted Ghost dead earlier. Much earlier. She had a version of power where Omari Hardwick's character would have died in the same block where Cannon died, cutting years of storyline off the map, torching one of the most valuable characters in modern cable television just because, according to 50 Cent, the star of the show was not the writer of the show, and that gap became a chasm. 50 Cent said number 50 Cent pushed back. Omari Hardwick got to live longer. And because Omari Hardwick got to live longer, power got to breathe. That is the story he told GQ. That is it. That is the whole quote in a nutshell, and if that story is even 70% accurate, it changes the way you rewatch every season of Power from tonight forward. Because every time you see Ghost walk into a room, every time you hear that Omari Hardwick voice drop an octave before he decides somebody's fate, you are watching a character who is almost erased before the story ever finished telling itself. You are watching a ghost who almost became one earlier than he was supposed to. Now, most people heard that and thought, okay, that is business, that is television, that is creative differences, that is normal. But then Rick Ross woke up. And when Rick Ross woke up, the internet caught fire, because Rick Ross decided this was the story he was going to plant his flag on. Rick Ross went on camera and did what Rick Ross has been doing all year, which is aim at 50 Cent and pull the trigger before he checks whether the barrel is pointed the right way. Rick Ross said, quote, "I want to go viral this morning, so Curtis, I ain't finished with you." Rick Ross said 50 Cent was making excuses about being kicked off his own shows. Rick Ross said 50 Cent was blaming a black woman for what happened, that Courtney Kemp is the creator, that she wrote it, that Ghost was her show, that Cannon was her show, and that she gave 50 Cent $3,500 an episode just to do little social media posts and nothing more. And then Rick Ross delivered the line that turned the whole conversation into a wildfire. Rick Ross said, and I want you to sit with this, be loyal to the black woman the way you are to Eminem. Woo. Hold on. Everybody, take a breath. Because that is not a bar. That is a grenade. Rick Ross just pulled the pin out of a race conversation on a Tuesday morning, and he tossed it into a room full of hip-hop fans who were still eating breakfast. And the moment that clip hit timelines, you could feel the culture take a step back and squint. Because whatever Rick Ross thought he was doing there, whatever chess move he thought he was making, what he actually did was open a door that he was not prepared to walk back through. And once that door is open, it never closes cleanly. Ever. In this culture, in this industry, in this era of screenshots and clip accounts and permanent receipts, you do not get to pull that bar back once the audio leaves your phone. That bar is on the ledger forever. That bar is a footnote in every future interview Rick Ross is ever going to sit down for, and no publicist in America is going to be able to scrub it clean. Now, truth is, right here, I want to be careful with this next stretch, because loyalty to the black woman is a real conversation. It is an important conversation, and it is not a punchline. And I am not going to sit here and audit 50 Cent's resume on that front, because that is not what this story is about. What this story is about is Rick Ross weaponizing that language for a beef he is clearly losing, and pretending it is a moral crusade instead of a personal grudge. There is a difference between accountability and camouflage, and Rick Ross reached for the camouflage. But even if you set that aside, even if you grant Rick Ross the benefit of the doubt on the framing, there is still one enormous problem with the argument he built, and it is the same problem that has followed him around all summer. Rick Ross keeps forgetting who Eminem is to 50 Cent, and Rick Ross keeps forgetting who 50 Cent is to hip-hop. And if you do not understand that history, you cannot understand why this line detonated in the exact opposite direction Rick Ross expected. You cannot understand why the culture, even people who have never rooted for 50 Cent in their lives, quietly took a step to 50 Cent's side of the room this week. Because let us rewind the tape. Let us go all the way back. 50 Cent did not walk into this industry on a red carpet. 50 Cent walked into this industry as an outcast, a man dissed by half the East Coast for a record called How to Rob, a man who was blackballed in rooms he built himself, a man whose life was almost taken from him on a street in Queens. And when 50 Cent was standing at that crossroads, dragging himself back onto the mixtape circuit with a hoodie, a bulletproof vest, and a jaw wired shut, the industry did not roll out a welcome. The industry looked the other way. And the person who did not look the other way, the person who reached across every unwritten rule in that business and pulled 50 Cent out of the wilderness, was a skinny kid from Detroit named Eminem. Eminem walked 50 Cent into Aftermath. Eminem walked 50 Cent to Drive Dre. Eminem put 50 Cent on the biggest stage the genre had ever built and said, "This is the guy, everybody move. That happened. That is history. That is not spin. That is not narrative. That is not a talking point. That is the paper trail of how Indie Club got made and how Get Rich or Die Tryin' turned into one of the most important debut albums in the history of rap. That is Wikipedia. That is documented. That is not up for debate. That is the sort of moment they are still going to be teaching in college hip-hop courses in the year 2050. So when Rick Ross rolls up on a Tuesday and tries to imply that 50 Cent should be more loyal to a black woman than he is to Eminem, he is not making the moral point he thinks he is making. What Rick Ross is doing is trying to sever 50 Cent from the one relationship in hip-hop that 50 Cent has protected with his life, and any real student of this culture knows how that sentence ends. It ends with 50 Cent replying calmly, professionally, and with a smile, and it ends with Rick Ross looking around wondering why the room went quiet. Because the room is not quiet by accident. The room is quiet because the room heard the swing miss. The room is quiet because the room knows the difference between a real point and a costume of a point, and Rick Ross showed up to the meeting in a costume. But listen, we are not done. Because Rick Ross did not stop there. Rick Ross also decided to take a swing at 50 Cent's newly announced project, the one where 50 Cent is teasing a record featuring Tupac and Eminem, and Rick Ross said, quote, "Hey boy, Pac been dead 30 years, let the man rest in peace." And then Rick Ross laughed. And Rick Ross told 50 Cent to put those Tony Yayo Lloyd Banks remixes out instead. And I am going to say this as respectfully as I can, because I try not to sit in judgment on this show, but that line is one of the most self-defeating lines Rick Ross has released in his entire discography, and he did not even release it on wax. Rick Ross released it on his phone. And a bar you release on your phone that you would never have released in a booth is a bar that already knows it lost. A bar that skips the booth and heads straight to the timeline is a bar that is afraid of being replayed with a beat under it. That is street-level insecurity dressed up as swagger, and everybody with an ear for it caught it in real time. Because let us do the math the way the numbers do the math. If a vault of unreleased Tupac music dropped tomorrow, it would outsell every album Rick Ross has released this decade combined, and I say that with a straight face. Tupac in 2026 still moves the needle. Tupac in 2026 still tops streaming charts on his death anniversary. Tupac in 2026 still owns real estate on every serious hip-hop playlist ever made. And Eminem, whatever you personally feel about Eminem, has sold more records than the entire MMG roster stacked on top of each other and then multiplied by 2. Eminem could put out an album of grocery lists and outsell most of the field. That is not a Rick Ross diss. That is math. That is the receipts. And when Rick Ross laughs at the idea of 50 Cent making a song with Eminem and Tupac, he is not laughing at 50 Cent. He is laughing at the mountain he is standing under. He is laughing at gravity. He is laughing at physics. And physics does not laugh back. Physics just keeps pulling everything down at the same speed until you are the only one left in the room still swinging. And here is the part that gets awkward, because Rick Ross keeps forgetting the room he is standing in. Jay-Z himself, just recently brought Eminem out at Yankee Stadium, and if you know anything about Jay-Z's stage in this era, you know Jay-Z does not hand out cameos, Jay-Z hands out coronations. Jay-Z put Eminem in front of that crowd because Jay-Z respects the resume, respects the discography, respects the history. And on the flip side of that same mountain, at the Super Bowl a couple of years back, Eminem refused to perform unless 50 Cent was on that stage with him. Refused. Not requested, refused. Because that is the loyalty tax Eminem pays in public, and that is the loyalty tax 50 Cent has quietly paid back for 2 decades. That is a bond most rappers in this industry will never have with another artist. And Rick Ross wants to walk up to that bond, poke it with a stick, and pretend it is a weakness. That is not smart. That is not strategic. That is a man walking into a hurricane holding a matchbook. That is a man showing up to a chess match with a checkers strategy and wondering why his king keeps falling over. So let me ask you something, and I want a real answer in the comments, because this is where the culture has to decide. Is Rick Ross overplaying the hand? Is Rick Ross pushing this too far? Because I do not make the news, I break the news down, but from where I am sitting, Rick Ross is not fighting 50 Cent anymore. Rick Ross is fighting his own reflection, and the reflection keeps winning. And every time Rick Ross throws a punch at that reflection, the mirror cracks a little more, and the version of Rick Ross the culture used to root for starts to fade with it. And that is a tragedy in slow motion, because there was a version of Rick Ross that was one of the most cinematic voices this genre has ever produced, and I do not want to lose that version to a beef the man cannot even win. Let us rewind back to Courtney Kemp for 1 second, because I do not want to skip over the actual business lesson buried underneath all this noise. What 50 Cent said about the friction between the writer and the star of Power is not a scandal. That is not a bombshell. That is the oldest story in television, and it happens on every hit show that has ever hit. Ask any showrunner who ever ran a hit alongside a superstar-level executive producer, and they will tell you the same story with different names attached. There is always a moment when the writer feels like the room is drifting toward the star, and there is always a moment when the star feels like the writer is trying to shorten his shadow. That is not gender. That is not race. That is not personality. That is the physics of a hit show, and the only people who survive it are the people who name it out loud and negotiate through it. Courtney Kemp and 50 Cent, whatever the tension was, produced the biggest cable drama of a generation. Ghost, Tommy, Cannon, Tasha, Tariq, every single one of those characters got etched into the culture because two extremely stubborn creative forces sat at the same table and refused to blink. That is a feature, not a bug. That is the machine working exactly the way it was designed to work. That is what happens when two people with genuine vision refuse to let the other one dilute it. Now, the Ghost decision, that one still stings. Because if you talk to fans of Power, and I mean the real fans, the ones who have been rewatching that final season on loop since it aired, you will hear the same complaint every single time. The show should not have ended when Ghost died. The show should have gone another 2 seasons at least. Ghost was the pillar. Ghost was the anchor. Ghost was the reason your grandmother started watching Power in the first place. And when Omari Hardwick's character got killed, the entire universe wobbled. The spin-offs did what they could, and some of them did it well, but nothing hit the same as Ghost in a room full of enemies, holding a glass of scotch, deciding whether tonight was the night he made someone disappear. And 50 Cent is telling us on camera that Ghost was almost killed years earlier. That Ghost was almost written off in the same episode as Cannon. That 50 Cent had to physically block the exit door and say no, this man lives, this man carries the show. And whether you agree with that call or not, that call kept Power alive. That call is why the franchise still prints money in 2026. That call is why the Power universe still has 4 active shows on the board. That call is why stars can still put the Power logo on a poster and have fans line up. So when Rick Ross tries to frame this as 50 Cent making excuses, Rick Ross is not reading the room correctly, because 50 Cent did not make excuses. 50 Cent explained the business. There is a difference. And every showrunner, every actor, every producer, every studio head who has ever worked in Hollywood is watching this Rick Ross rant and shaking their head, because Rick Ross is speaking on rooms he has never been inside. Rick Ross has never sat in a writer's room at 4 in the morning fighting for a character's life. Rick Ross has never sat across from a network executive with a deck of pilots on the table. Rick Ross is speaking as a fan, not as a player, and it shows in every syllable. It shows in the pacing of his sentences. It shows in the way he leans on generalities when the specifics would have caught him lying. And this is where I have to be honest with you, because I have been sitting on this thought for weeks, and I do not think I can hold it any longer. Rick Ross is losing this thing. Rick Ross is losing this thing publicly, and every time he opens his mouth, the margin gets wider. Because the trap Rick Ross keeps stepping into is that Rick Ross keeps trying to fight 50 Cent on 50 Cent's turf. Rick Ross keeps trying to fight 50 Cent on the internet, in the comments, in the clips, in the shots, in the Instagram jokes, in the podcast quotes. And that is the exact terrain where 50 Cent has been undefeated for 15 straight years. Nobody has ever gone into that arena with 50 Cent and walked out with the belt. Nobody. Not Ja Rule, not Fat Joe in his prime, not the countless bloggers who tried to trade jabs with the man on Instagram at 3 in the morning. That fight cannot be won. That fight has never been won. And Rick Ross is out here trying to win it with a race framing that is not landing, an Eminem shot that is not landing, a Tupac shot that is not landing, and a Courtney Kemp defense that is not landing. That is 0 for 4 in one press cycle. That is not a rap beef, that is a demo reel of self-inflicted wounds. That is a highlight tape of every mistake a veteran rapper is supposed to have unlearned by now. That is a masterclass in how to lose a battle you technically started. Because here is what actually happens when you diss Eminem in 2026. Eminem does not respond. Eminem has never had to respond, because Eminem's discography responds for him. You cannot diss a man whose Wikipedia page runs longer than your entire catalog. You cannot diss a man who Jay-Z brings out at Yankee Stadium as a gesture of respect. You cannot diss a man who has done the work, done the numbers, done the resume, done the awards, and done the touring at every level of the game. What you can do is make yourself look small trying to swing at him. And that is exactly what Rick Ross did on Tuesday. Rick Ross did not damage Eminem. Rick Ross did not damage 50 Cent. Rick Ross damaged Rick Ross. And the tape does not lie about that. The tape never lies about that. The tape is a court reporter who never sleeps, and it is going to be there in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, on some year-end retrospective, playing back for a generation that was not even old enough to remember when Rick Ross was making deeper than rap and everybody said the man was untouchable. And I want to circle back to that Tupac line, because it is the one that is going to age the worst. Rick Ross said, "Let the man rest in peace, 30 years dead." But Rick Ross knows, and everybody in this industry knows, that Tupac Amaru Shakur has never actually rested. Tupac's catalog releases have outsold Rick Ross's last 3 albums combined, and Tupac has not physically been in a studio since 1996. That is not a diss to Rick Ross. That is a statistic. Tupac is a fixed star. Tupac is a monument. And when 50 Cent teases a record with Tupac, he is not disrespecting the legend. He is participating in a tradition that has produced some of the biggest posthumous moments in music history. From Notorious B.I.G. collaborations to Nipsey Hussle features to Michael Jackson posthumous singles, the industry has always found a way to let a giant voice speak from the vault. And 50 Cent, who came up under Tupac's shadow, who was carrying that Southside Jamaica Queen's torch when Tupac's blueprint was still fresh on the pavement, has more standing than most to be the vessel for a record like that. 50 Cent has bar for bar earned that connection. 50 Cent has scar for scar earned that connection. Whether the record itself lives up to the promise, we will find out. But the right to try it, that belongs to him. That is not up for a vote. That is not up for a Rick Ross opinion. That is a stripe 50 Cent earned in blood 2 decades ago. So when Rick Ross laughs at the idea, the laugh sounds hollow. Because the culture is not laughing with Rick Ross. The culture is looking at Rick Ross the way you look at a friend who will not stop talking at a table where the conversation has moved on. And that is the loneliest place a rapper can be, because there is no comeback from being irrelevant in your own beef. There is no rebound stat for that. There is no retroactive fix for that. Once the culture stops laughing with you and starts laughing at you, the road back is not a road anymore, it is a climb. And that climb is uphill in every direction, in the dark, with no rope, and Rick Ross has to make it while carrying every single one of these self-inflicted wounds on his back. Now, let me tell you what is really going on here, because I have been watching this too long to pretend I do not see the pattern. Rick Ross is not trying to win a rap beef anymore. Rick Ross is trying to stay in the conversation. Rick Ross is trying to keep his name on timelines. And I get it, I do, because Rick Ross came up in an era where relevance was oxygen and silence was death, and when your last album cycle did not move the way you wanted it to move, you reached for the loudest, sharpest tool in the shed, and right now, in 2026, the sharpest tool Rick Ross can find is 50 Cent's name. Because the second you type 50 Cent into a caption, the algorithm wakes up. That is the game. That is the honest truth of what we are watching. Rick Ross is farming 50 Cent for engagement, and 50 Cent is farming Rick Ross for content. It is a symbiotic relationship dressed up as a war, and both men know it. Both men have known it for a decade. Both men wake up in the morning, look at their notifications, and secretly hope the other one posted something new before breakfast. But the difference, the crucial difference, is that 50 Cent is farming Rick Ross with a smile on his face and a G-Unit hoodie on his back and a television empire behind him, and Rick Ross is farming 50 Cent with a race framing on Tuesday, an Eminem shot on Wednesday, and a Tupac shot on Thursday, and by Friday, the culture is tired. And when the culture gets tired of you before your opponent does, the beef is already over. You just have not been told yet. Somebody has to walk into the dressing room and hand you the letter, and Rick Ross is out here checking the mail like the letter is going to be good news. It is not going to be good news. It has not been good news in months. Now, before we roll to the outro, I have to give you one more layer, because I do not want to leave this on the table. If you rewind Rick Ross's press cycle for the last 12 months, you will notice a pattern that is impossible to unsee once you see it. Every single time Rick Ross puts out an album, the promotional campaign is not the album. The promotional campaign is 50 Cent. Every single interview cycle turns into a 50 Cent interview cycle. Every single clip that leaves that room is a 50 Cent clip. And the album itself, the actual music, the reason you are supposedly there, gets swallowed by the noise. And that is a form of career self-sabotage that is very hard to reverse, because once you train your audience to only pay attention when you are beefing, they stop paying attention when you are making music. Ask anybody who has ever been on the wrong end of that cycle. It is not a small mistake. It is a career-shaped mistake. And Rick Ross is making it in slow motion, in public, on a live stream, with a smile. And the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night, if I am being honest, is that Rick Ross is smart enough to know he is doing it. Which means he has made peace with the trade. And that is a sadder story than any beef could ever be. That is a rapper trading his legacy for a week of trending and pretending the exchange rate is fair. So the question I am putting on the table for you is this. Is Rick Ross crossing a line he cannot come back from, or is Rick Ross doing exactly what he wants to do, playing the villain role on purpose, riding the algorithm all the way to the next single? Because I can argue both sides in my sleep. I can tell you the villain arc is smart. I can tell you the villain arc is calculated. I can tell you the villain arc keeps a Wingstop on the map. But I can also tell you the villain arc has to be earned. The villain arc has to be sharp. The villain arc has to land its punches, and Rick Ross is missing on every single swing. And a villain who misses is not a villain. A villain who misses is a comedy show. A villain who misses is a Saturday morning cartoon. And nobody is scared of a Saturday morning cartoon. Nobody is buying tickets to see a villain who trips over his own cape on the way to the stage. Which brings us right back to Courtney Kemp, because I do not want you to walk away from this video thinking she is the pawn in this game. She is not. Courtney Kemp is the architect of a billion-dollar television universe. Courtney Kemp is one of the most powerful showrunners of color in Hollywood. Courtney Kemp does not need Rick Ross to defend her, and Courtney Kemp does not need 50 Cent to explain her. Courtney Kemp built her own castle, and whatever tension existed inside that writer's room stayed inside that writer's room, and produced Ghost, produced Tommy, produced Cannon, produced Tarek. If the friction 50 Cent described in that GQ sit-down is the price of that legacy, then the legacy paid the price back 1,000 times over. And anybody trying to weaponize her name to score points against 50 Cent is not defending her, they are using her. And Courtney Kemp is nobody's talking point. Courtney Kemp is nobody's chess piece. Courtney Kemp is a boss in her own right, and she deserves to be discussed as one. And I am willing to bet money that if you asked Courtney Kemp herself, on the record, whether she wanted Rick Ross out here in her name this week, she would give you an answer so cold it would frost the microphone. That is the part Rick Ross missed. That is the beat he stepped on. Because you cannot claim to be defending a black woman's honor on Tuesday morning while simultaneously turning her into a rhetorical weapon in your personal feud with a rival. That is not defense. That is deployment. And there is a difference. And every executive, every writer, every producer, every showrunner watching this play out is quietly noting who used her as a shield and who actually respected her voice. The industry sees it. The rooms see it. The people who greenlight the next Courtney Kemp production see it. And when the dust settles on this news cycle, it is not going to be Rick Ross getting the phone call for the next big executive producer credit. It is going to be 50 Cent. Again. And again after that. And again after that. Because that is how the machine actually works when the cameras are off. So, where does this leave us, culture? Where does this leave the game? Because right now we have 50 Cent sitting on a television empire, teasing a Tupac and Eminem record, running PowerBook 4 influence into production, and quietly executive producing his way into an entire vertical of streaming. And on the other side of the ring, we have Rick Ross firing tweets, dropping race framings, laughing at legends, and losing altitude in real time. This is not a fair fight. This has not been a fair fight for a long time. And every time Rick Ross opens his mouth, the fight gets less fair, because the audience keeps checking the scoreboard and the scoreboard keeps saying the same thing. And that scoreboard, if you have been paying attention, has not moved in either direction for months. The needle is stuck. And the needle being stuck is the story. Tell me if I am reading this wrong. Tell me if I am missing something. Because from my seat, Rick Ross is not losing this thing quietly. Rick Ross is losing this thing on the front page. And the man on the other side of the ring is not even breaking a sweat. 50 Cent is doing interviews, cutting checks, greenlighting shows, and letting Rick Ross yell into the void. And that is the most 50 Cent way to win a beef that has ever existed, because 50 Cent figured out a long time ago that the loudest man in the argument is almost never the winner. The winner is the man whose empire keeps growing while the loud man is still typing. The winner is the man whose calendar is full while the loud man is still refreshing his mentions. The winner is the man building while the other man is broadcasting. So I am going to leave you with this. Rick Ross has a choice to make in the next 30 days, and it is a real one. Rick Ross can either keep swinging at 50 Cent, keep swinging at Eminem, keep swinging at Tupac, keep swinging at every immovable object in the culture, and watch the margin get wider every week. Or Rick Ross can go quiet, go make an album, go make a real one, go make one where the music does the talking, and let 50 Cent farm somebody else for content for a while. But I have watched Rick Ross for 20 years, and I do not think he takes the exit. I think he keeps swinging. I think he keeps missing. I think he keeps posting. And I think this same story is going to be sitting on my desk again next Tuesday, with a new shot, a new headline, and a new self-inflicted wound. And I hope I am wrong. I really do. Because there is a version of Rick Ross that is still one of the best voices this genre ever produced, and that version is getting harder and harder to hear over the noise. That version deserves better than a Tuesday morning race grenade. That version deserves a mic, a booth, and a beat. Because that is the pattern. That is the loop. That is the arc. And nobody breaks the loop until the culture tells them to. And the culture, from what I can see, is very close to telling Rick Ross to sit this one down. The signs are there. The comments are there. The engagement metrics are there. The fatigue is there. And once fatigue sets in with an audience, the timer starts and Rick Ross does not control that timer. Nobody does. Not even 50 Cent. Not even Courtney Kemp. Not even Eminem. That timer belongs to the audience, and the audience always collects. And when the audience collects, the collection is public, permanent, and unforgiving. Ask any rapper who has ever tried to stage a comeback after the culture already voted him out. The seat gets colder every year. The mic feels heavier every year. And the room that used to open up for you starts closing in on you, one door at a time, until the only door left is the exit. So tell me everything below, because I read them all. Is Rick Ross overplaying his hand? Is 50 Cent letting Rick Ross beat himself? Is Courtney Kemp being used as a shield by both sides? Should Rick Ross apologize to Eminem, apologize to Tupac's estate, apologize to himself? Should 50 Cent actually drop this Eminem and Tupac record, or is it going to end up being another one of those projects the internet talks about for 6 months and then forgets? Drop the honest answer in the comments. Drop the take that scares you. Drop the take that gets you canceled. I want to hear all of it. And if you rocked with this one, hit that like button, hit that subscribe, hit that bell, because we are dropping breakdowns like this every single day, and you do not want to miss the next one. Roll into the next one I have got queued for you, because 50 Cent's Tupac and Eminem record is not the only shockwave hitting the culture this month, and the next story on my desk is going to make this one look like a warm-up. It involves a name you did not see coming, a receipt nobody wanted printed, and a moment that is about to reshape the way this whole feud gets covered from here on out. Trust me, you're going to want to see this one before the algorithm buries it, because clips like this do not stay up for long once the wrong lawyers start watching. And once the wrong lawyers start watching, everything speeds up, everything gets rewritten, and the story you thought you were following turns into a completely different story overnight. So stay locked in. Stay ready. Peace, love, and light, and I will see you in the next breakdown.